A single droplet of sweat on a man's forehead almost started the greatest interstellar war in a millennium. It was not an assassin's blade or a smuggled warhead that brought the gleaming corridors of Station Aegis to a dead halt, but a tiny foil-wrapped package smuggled out of New Texas. Station Aegis was the shining jewel of the Galactic Cooperative. Imagine a city the size of Manhattan, wrought from spun diamond and polished osmium, gracefully rotating in the void between three dying stars. It was a neutral ground where thousands of species came to trade, to argue, and to define the laws of the known universe. Right now, the halls were buzzing with unprecedented tension because humanity was knocking on the door. Earth wanted a permanent seat on the High Council. To the established alien factions, this was a terrifying prospect. In the eyes of the wider galaxy, humans were volatile, primitive, and dangerously unpredictable. We were the species that weaponized our own planetary atmosphere before we figured out faster-than-light travel. We were the reckless upstarts. Marcus Vance did not feel like a reckless upstart. He felt like a man who had spent 14 straight hours listening to a gelatinous ambassador from the deep core worlds complain about the thermal output of the human delegation's transport ships. Marcus was the chief engineer of the human contingent. His job was to make sure our technology played nice with alien power grids. But mostly, his job was to stand in the background and try not to offend anyone. He was thoroughly exhausted, back in his private quarters. Marcus sealed the reinforced door and activated the privacy wards. He did not want to look at another star chart. He did not want to engage in nuanced diplomacy. He wanted a piece of home. From the hidden compartment of his heavily encrypted tool locker, he extracted a vacuum-sealed pouch. It was a care package from his brother back on Earth. The label, written in faded black marker, read, "Devil's Breath Curry, eat at your own risk." Marcus fired up his personal thermal induction unit. As the thick, reddish-brown paste began to bubble, a pungent, sharp aroma filled the small room. It was an earth-shattering blend of garlic, cumin, and the notorious ghost pepper, a capsaicin-heavy monstrosity cultivated to deliver maximum culinary violence. To Marcus, it smelled like absolute heaven. He sat down, grabbed his spoon, and prepared for the painful, endorphin-rushing bliss of a genuinely spicy meal. 3 sectors away, in the pristine, hyper-sterilized environment of the Central Medical Spire, Chief Medical Officer Zale was having a very different kind of evening. Zale belonged to an avian-descended species known for their brittle bones, their towering intellect, and their pathological need for order. Covered in sleek, iridescent blue feathers, Zale stood before a massive semicircular console, monitoring the atmospheric scrubbers and biofilters for the entire station. Keeping thousands of different biological entities breathing the same recycled air without cross-contaminating their immune systems was a monumental task. Zale approached it with religious devotion. Suddenly, the gentle ambient hum of the medical bay was shattered by a blaring crimson alert. The holographic projection of Sector 4, specifically the human delegation's residential block, began flashing a violent shade of red. Zale's dark, multifaceted eyes widened. He rapidly tapped the interface, pulling up the spectral analysis of the anomaly. The station's deep space atmospheric sensors had detected a massive spike in volatile organic compounds. The computer categorized it immediately as a Class 5 biochemical agent. It was an aerosolized neurotoxin, specifically a highly concentrated vanilloid receptor agonist. According to the database, this chemical would bind directly to pain receptors, tricking the nervous system into believing it was literally on fire before inducing severe respiratory distress and catastrophic tissue inflammation. It was a chemical weapon of terrifying efficiency. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped the chief medical officer. The concentration levels in the air were off the charts. Whoever was inside that room was surely already dead, their lungs dissolving into a caustic puddle. Zale slammed his talon down on the emergency override. Klaxons screamed through the pristine corridors of Station Aegis. Heavy titanium blast doors slammed shut across the sector, sealing off the human wing from the rest of the floating city. Red emergency lighting bathed the walls. The station's central artificial intelligence announced a code black quarantine in a calm, chillingly pleasant voice. Zale did not wait for the politicians to argue. He authorized the immediate deployment of the hazard eradication team. They were the absolute best the cooperative had to offer. Towering, heavily armored peacekeepers encased in environmentally sealed dreadnought suits, armed with thermal sterilization rifles. Their orders were simple: breach the room, neutralize the source of the biological agent, and recover the remains of the human ambassador's chief engineer. As the hazard team marched down the sealed corridor, their heavy metallic boots echoing like thunder, Zale watched the live telemetry from his command console. The chemical concentration was still rising. It was pooling in the center of the room. He braced himself for the horrific visual feed. The political fallout from a human being assassinated on cooperative soil with a chemical weapon would be catastrophic. It would ruin the summit. It could start a war. The strike team stacked up outside Marcus's quarters. The squad leader placed a breaching charge on the reinforced door. A silent countdown flashed on their visual displays. The charge detonated, blowing the heavy door completely off its hinges. The metal slab crashed onto the floor of the quarters, kicking up a cloud of debris. The hazard team poured into the room, their weapons raised, scanning for hostile combatants or a leaking chemical warhead. They expected carnage. They expected to find a dissolved corpse. Instead, the smoke cleared to reveal Marcus Vance sitting at a small metal table. Marcus froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He was a terrifying sight to the alien intruders. His face was flushed a violent, alarming crimson. Profuse amounts of liquid poured from his tear ducts, streaming down his cheeks. Heavy beads of sweat coated his forehead and soaked the collar of his uniform. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with deep, ragged gasps. To the hazard team, these were the textbook symptoms of late-stage nerve gas exposure. The human was clearly in agonizing pain, his body fighting a losing battle against the lethal toxin. "Hold your fire. The subject is still alive." The squad leader barked through the localized comms channel, his voice trembling with shock. "Secure the bioweapon. Get a containment field around that object on the table." Two heavily armored operatives rushed forward, aiming their thermal rifles not at Marcus, but at the steaming bowl of reddish-brown sludge. The readings on their visors were going crazy. The bowl was the absolute epicenter of the Class 5 toxin. Marcus, blinking rapidly through his tears, looked at the massive, faceless alien soldiers aiming high-yield plasma weaponry at his dinner. He sniffled, wiped his nose with the back of his hand, and swallowed the mouthful of fiery curry. "Can I help you guys?" Marcus asked, his voice thick and hoarse from the spice. "You're kind of ruining my dinner." The squad leader stared at him, utterly paralyzed by the impossibility of the situation. "Human Vance, do not move. You have been exposed to a lethal dose of a corrosive neuroagent. We are initiating emergency life-saving procedures." Marcus looked down at his bowl, then back up at the heavily armed squad. A slow realization washed over him, followed by a sudden booming laugh. He laughed so hard he started coughing, which only made his face redder and caused more tears to flow, further terrifying the hazard team. "Neuroagent," Marcus gasped, taking a deep breath of the spicy air. "Hey guys, this is my brother's ghost pepper curry. It's just spicy food." Up in the medical spire, Zale watched the feed in stunned silence. His mind, capable of processing complex quantum biochemical equations in seconds, simply could not comprehend what he was seeing. The human was not just surviving a lethal dose of a chemical weapon. He was consuming it for pleasure. Zale realized with a sinking feeling that humanity was far more terrifying than the Galactic Cooperative had ever imagined. While the medical team scrambled to understand the impossible biology of the humans, a shadow moved in the lower docking bays. The lockdown had paralyzed the station's internal security grid, blinding the main sensors for exactly 4 minutes. It was all the time the unseen intruders needed to slip past the perimeter, carrying cargo that would make a ghost pepper look completely harmless. The transparent walls of a level 5 biocontainment cell were engineered to quarantine the most devastating plagues in the known universe. Not a mildly irritated engineer with a lingering case of the hiccups. Marcus Vance sat cross-legged on a floating gravcot, shivering in a thin, sterile paper gown. He had been violently scrubbed down by automated chemical jets, his clothes incinerated, and his precious bowl of ghost pepper curry locked away inside a reinforced stasis vault. Outside his glass cage, a dozen heavily armed security operatives stood watch, their weapons trained on him as if he might suddenly spontaneously combust and take the entire sector down with him. Marcus merely sighed, rubbing his temples, mourning the loss of a perfectly good meal. Up in the central medical spire, the atmosphere was considerably less calm. The main doors to the diagnostic hub parted with a sharp pneumatic hiss, admitting Dr. Elena Rostova. As the human delegation's lead xenobiologist, Elena possessed an intellect sharp enough to cut through hull plating and a baseline patience level that plummeted to 0 when confronted with bureaucratic incompetence. She marched across the polished floor, her lab coat flaring behind her, heading straight for the chief medical officer. Doctor. Zale stood by the main holographic display, his iridescent blue feathers ruffled in extreme distress. He was currently trying to map the molecular structure of the agonizing chemical weapon they had just confiscated. Elena did not offer a greeting. She slammed her datapad down onto Zale's pristine console, disrupting the holographic projection. "Release my engineer immediately," Elena demanded, her voice a whip crack of authority. "And return his dinner. You are making an absolute fool of yourself and this entire station." Zale blinked, his dark, multifaceted eyes focusing on the furious human woman. He drew himself up to his full, imposing height, attempting to project the dignity expected of a cooperative official. "Dr. Rostova, your engineer has deliberately released a Class 5 neuroagent into a secure environment. He is highly toxic. We are currently trying to synthesize a counteragent before his internal organs completely liquefy." Elena let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She leaned forward, invading Zale's personal space, forcing the avian doctor to step back slightly. "He is not toxic. He is digesting. What your incredibly expensive, hypersensitive sensors detected is called capsaicin. It is an active component of chili peppers, a plant from our homeworld." Zale's beak parted slightly in confusion. A plant that naturally synthesizes a weaponized vanilloid receptor agonist. "It is a defense mechanism," Elena explained, her tone softening just a fraction as she recognized the genuine scientific bewilderment in his eyes. The plant evolved to deter mammals from eating it by simulating a burning sensation. We humans simply happen to enjoy the psychological thrill of defying botanical evolution. Zale stared at her. His brilliant mind raced to process the absurdity of her statement. You consume a chemical designed to inflict severe neurological pain for recreation. "We are a very stubborn species, Doctor," Elena said, a faint, completely involuntary smile touching her lips. Zale found himself staring at that smile. For a moment, The crisis faded into the background. He observed the fierce intelligence radiating from her, the unyielding posture, the sheer audacity of a species that found pleasure in biological warfare. He found it simultaneously terrifying and deeply fascinating. A strange, unfamiliar warmth blossomed in his chest, a stark contrast to his usual cold, calculated logic. Elena, too, felt the sudden shift in the air. She noticed the elegant, precise way Zale's talons hovered over the console, the genuine dedication to preserving life that drove his current panic. They were two scientists from entirely different worlds, standing on opposite sides of a ridiculous misunderstanding, yet perfectly matching each other's intellectual rhythm. Their quiet moment of connection was shattered by a voice like crushed velvet sliding over broken glass. Fascinating. The humans are not only volatile, but they now attempt to mask their biological weaponry as culinary quirks. Elena and Zale turned in unison. Standing at the entrance of the medical hub was Ambassador Vrek of the Silari Concord. Vrek was a towering figure, his body covered in sleek obsidian scales that seemed to absorb the light around him. He wore the flowing crimson robes of his station, and his narrow vertical slit eyes gleamed with undisguised malice. The Silari were known throughout the cooperative as master manipulators, a species that treated politics as a blood sport. Vrek had been the loudest voice opposing humanity's induction into the High Council. And right now, he looked like a predator that had just cornered a wounded animal. Ambassador Vrek, Zale said, his feathers instantly flattening into a defensive posture. This is a restricted medical area. And this is a matter of galactic security, Vrek countered, gliding gracefully into the room. He ignored Zale and fixed his cold gaze on Elena. Your delegation has brought a highly restricted neurotoxin onto a diplomatic station, triggering a code black lockdown. The council is already convening an emergency session. It is food, Vrek, Elena snapped, her fists clenching at her sides. If you had a basic understanding of mammalian biology, you would know that. Vrek offered a slow, chilling smile. The truth of mammalian biology is entirely irrelevant. Dr. Rostova, what matters is what the station's populace believes. The Silari ambassador tapped a slender device on his wrist. Instantly, every secondary monitor in the medical bay flared to life. The feeds were not restricted to the medical channel. They were being broadcast directly to the public concourses, the commercial sectors, and the private quarters of every single diplomat on Station Aegis. The footage playing on a continuous loop was the helmet cam recording from the hazard team. It showed Marcus Vance in his quarters, red-faced, sweating profusely, tears streaming down his face as he gasped for air. Without the context of the curry bowl, which had been perfectly framed out of the shot, Marcus looked exactly like a man dying a horrific, agonizing death from a biological attack. He beheld the human menace. Vrek's silken voice echoed over the station's public address system, perfectly synchronized with the video feed. They smuggle weapons of mass suffering into our sanctuary. They weaponize the very air we breathe. Can we trust such savages with a seat on our High Council? We must protect ourselves. We must expel them immediately. Elena watched the broadcast in sheer horror. She knew how fast fear could spread in an enclosed environment. The alien denizens of Station Aegis were already terrified of humanity's dark, violent history. Seeing a human apparently melting from the inside out due to a chemical leak would incite absolute panic. It was a masterclass in political assassination, orchestrated in a matter of minutes. Zale frantically typed on his console, trying to cut the feed. But Vrek had somehow bypassed the central medical override. The Silari ambassador had planned this with terrifying speed. You are inciting a riot, Zale warned, his voice tight with anger. I am ensuring the safety of the cooperative, Vrek replied smoothly, turning to leave. Your engineer will remain in permanent custody. I expect the human delegation to be packed and ready for deportation before the next solar rotation. Good day, Doctor. As Rex swept out of the room, Elena slammed her hand against the wall. The situation had escalated from a comedic misunderstanding into a devastating political crisis. But as she watched the looped footage of Marcus crying over his spicy dinner, her highly trained analytical mind snagged on a glaring inconsistency. Rek had arrived at the medical bay and hijacked the communication grid entirely too fast. It was almost as if he had been waiting for a major distraction to occur. Furthermore, while the entire station's security apparatus was focused tightly on the human sector and the supposed chemical threat, no one was looking anywhere else. She remembered the 4-minute blind spot in the sensor grid when the lockdown first initiated. A terrifying thought began to take root in her mind. A suspicion that Rek was using the ghost pepper incident to hide something far more dangerous moving through the shadows of the station. A microscopic speck of Earth vegetation was about to unravel a galactic conspiracy. Zale stood alone in the sterilized quiet of his private laboratory, staring at the impossible data cascading down his primary monitor. The chief medical officer had confiscated a single milligram of the reddish-brown sludge from the human engineer's quarters. He placed it inside a quantum resonance spectrometer, expecting to map the destructive bonds of a military-grade weapon. What he found instead was an architectural masterpiece of botanical evolution. The molecule, which the human xenobiologist had called capsaicin, was entirely harmless to tissue. It possessed no corrosive properties. It did not break down cellular walls or interrupt respiratory function on a chemical level. Zale watched the holographic simulation of the molecule binding to a digital model of a mammalian pain receptor. The results were staggering. The chemical acted as a perfect, deceitful key. It unlocked the neurological pathways responsible for sensing extreme heat and physical damage, flooding the brain with panic signals. It essentially convinced the host organism that it was standing in an active volcano, triggering sweat, tears, and hyperventilation, all while the physical body remained completely undamaged. It was a neurological ghost. A profound sense of awe washed over the avian doctor. The humans deliberately ingested this neurological liar to experience the adrenaline rush of surviving a lethal threat, all from the safety of their dining tables. It was absolute madness, but it was also a testament to their psychological resilience. His mind drifted to Dr. Elena Rostova. He recalled the fierce protective fire in her eyes, her unyielding defense of her crewmen, and her sharp, undeniable intellect. The humans were not the primitive savages the High Council feared. They were complex, daring, and fiercely loyal. Zale felt a sudden, intense desire to clear their name, a motivation that went far beyond his sworn duty to medical neutrality. To present an undeniable defense to the Council, Zale needed to compile a flawless timeline of the event. He accessed the station's central mainframe, pulling the exact microsecond the atmospheric sensors detected the curry and triggered the code black quarantine. As the massive data stream scrolled past his dark eyes, a jarring inconsistency caught his attention. During the exact moment the quarantine alarms began screaming, the station's automated defense grid experienced a catastrophic power fluctuation. For precisely 4 minutes, the magnetic containment fields and bioscanners in the lower industrial sectors went completely dark. The central computer logged this anomaly as an emergency power redirection to reinforce the human sector's blast doors. Zale frowned. His feathers bristled with sudden suspicion. As chief medical officer, he possessed Level 1 clearance, allowing him to audit the power grid's raw telemetry. He bypassed the summarized log and dug directly into the raw energy routing data. The power had not been redirected to the human sector. It had been intentionally bled off into a dummy sinkhole to create a localized blackout. His talons flew across the holographic interface, tracing the blind spot. He pulled up the passive spatial radar logs from the exterior defense buoys, which operated on an independent analog power source. The radar data painted a chilling picture. During those 4 blind minutes, 3 massive unregistered cargo shuttles slipped out of the chaotic traffic lanes outside the station. They coasted through the disabled magnetic containment field of Auxiliary Bay 9, completely bypassing customs, security, and biological screening. Zale enhanced the warp signatures lingering in the shuttle's wake. They belonged to the Solari Concorde. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The human engineer and his spicy food were nothing more than a spectacular coincidence. Ambassador Vrek had weaponized the station's automated panic. He had used the terrifying spectacle of a supposed human biological attack to blind the station's security apparatus, creating the perfect untraceable window to smuggle something massive and highly illegal aboard Station Aegis. Zale rapidly bundled the spectrometer analysis of the capsaicin, the altered power logs, and the radar signatures of the Solari shuttles into a heavily encrypted data packet. This was definitive proof of Rek's manipulation. It would instantly exonerate the humans and expose the Solari ambassador's treason to the entire High Council. He opened a direct priority channel to the High Council chambers and pressed the transmit rune. The console chimed a harsh, dissonant note. The screen flashed a violent amber. A text prompt materialized in the center of his display: access denied. Security credentials revoked by order of Ambassador Vrek. Emergency acting chair of station security. Zale stared at the screen, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. Vrek had already anticipated interference. The Solari ambassador was consolidating power faster than anyone could react. Zale reached for the manual comms unit to broadcast a station-wide audio warning. But before his talon could touch the dial, the primary lights in his laboratory instantly died. The room was plunged into pitch darkness, save for the faint pulsing glow of the emergency backup strips along the floor. The heavy pneumatic seals on the laboratory door engaged with a deep, resonant thud, locking him inside. The ventilation scrubbers spun down into silence. Zale stood perfectly still, his avian hearing, highly evolved to detect the faintest rustle of leaves in a dense canopy, strained against the suffocating silence. He heard it, a soft, deliberate shift of weight near the ceiling ventilation grate. Someone else was in the room. He slowly backed away from the console, moving toward the sterilized equipment racks. The shadows above him seemed to coalesce and detach from the ceiling. A figure dropped to the floor with terrifying grace, landing entirely without sound. The emergency lights illuminated the intruder. It was a Solari operative, clad in a skin-tight suit of active camouflage polymer that rippled and shifted, trying to mimic the dark laboratory walls. The assassin's face was obscured by a smooth, featureless tactical visor. In its right hand, the operative held a high-frequency molecular blade, the edge vibrating so fast it created a faint, lethal distortion in the air. Vrek had not just revoked Zale's access. He had sent an executioner to ensure the doctor's silence was permanent. Zale was a man of science, an academic who had spent his life healing. His species possessed hollow bones to aid in agility, making them incredibly fragile in physical combat. Facing a biologically engineered Solari killer in close quarters was an absolute death sentence. The operative lunged, crossing the room in a fraction of a second. The vibrating blade swept toward Zale's throat in a precise, deadly arc. Zale threw his body backward, his natural agility allowing him to narrowly avoid the strike. The blade sliced through the primary holographic console, neatly bisecting the thick metallic casing as if it were water. Sparks showered the darkened room, Scrambling backward, Zale's talons gripped the edge of a heavy surgical cart. He hurled it into the operative's path, but the assassin simply vaulted over the tumbling metal, entirely breaking its momentum, and landed gracefully directly in front of Zale. The assassin raised the blade for a final downward thrust. Zale had no weapons, no armor, and no physical strength to match his attacker. He only had his towering intellect and a comprehensive knowledge of everything stored in this room. He fell backward against a cryo-storage unit, his hand blindly searching the side panel. He felt the emergency pressure release valve. As the operative brought the blade down, Zale wrenched the valve open with all his might. A pressurized torrent of medical-grade liquid nitrogen blasted from the side of the unit, engulfing the assassin in a cloud of blinding, freezing vapor. The operative staggered back, their thermal-regulated armor instantly frosting over. The intense cold disrupted the act of camouflage, forcing the suit to default to a stark, highly visible white. It was a brilliant tactical delay, but Zale knew it was not a victory. The Solari physiology was incredibly resilient. The assassin would recover in seconds. As the freezing vapor began to clear, Zale saw the operative shatter the ice forming on their visor, the featureless mask turning back toward him with cold, mechanical fury. Trapped in the sealed, darkened room with a recovering killer, Zale realized his vast intellect might not be enough to keep him alive long enough to see Elena Rostova again. A prison cell designed to hold a biological terror is nothing more than an engineering puzzle to a bored human mechanic. The absolute silence of the maximum security containment block was about to be shattered. Marcus Vance was not pacing. He was sitting perfectly still on his floating gravcot, his eyes closed, his mind mapping the unseen wiring of the room. Before the heavy security guards had incinerated his uniform, Marcus had managed to palm a highly restricted micro-titanium multi-tool. It was currently wedged beneath his thumbnail, an invisible sliver of human ingenuity. He had already spent the last hour meticulously scraping away the micro-resin sealing the cell's internal communication port, located just behind his cot. By hardwiring the tiny tool into the port, Marcus had essentially turned his own skeleton into an antenna. Picking up the unencrypted low-frequency radio chatter of the station's automated maintenance drones. It was a crude workaround, but it allowed him to listen to the digital pulse of Station Aegis. Suddenly, the rhythmic hum of the data stream spiked violently. A massive, localized power drain occurred in the central medical spire, specifically in the chief medical officer's private laboratory. The diagnostic drones began broadcasting a panicked cascade of error codes indicating a forced manual lockdown and a sudden temperature drop. Marcus opened his eyes. He knew exactly who was in that laboratory. He also knew that forced lockdowns and sudden temperature drops usually meant someone was trying to kill someone else. He needed to get out of the glass cage. Marcus approached the heavy biometric lock securing the transparent wall. It was a sophisticated optical and chemical sensor, designed to read the unique biological signature of authorized personnel. He possessed no such signature. He looked down at his bare arm, clad only in the thin paper medical gown. During his frantic struggle to save his dinner, a single highly concentrated drop of the ghost pepper chili oil had splashed onto his wrist. The automated chemical scrubbers had missed it because it had seeped slightly under the edge of his thumbnail. It was a microscopic payload of weaponized capsaicin. Marcus extracted the multi-tool and activated its micro-welding function. A tiny, intense point of heat. He scraped the dried oil from his skin, placing the fiery residue directly onto the lock's sensitive chemical sampling pad. Then, he applied the micro-welder. The heat instantly vaporized the concentrated capsaicin, shooting a microscopic superheated jet of pure thermal chemical agony directly into the lock's delicate internal sensors. The machine's logic board, programmed to detect standard biological contaminants, was completely overwhelmed by the sudden localized spike in fake thermal data, believing it was experiencing a catastrophic internal fire. The lock's fail-safe protocol engaged. The heavy glass door slid open with a smooth pneumatic sigh. Marcus stepped out of the cell. The corridor was empty, the guards likely redeployed to handle the fake biological crisis still panicking the station's upper levels. Marcus did not hesitate. He broke into a dead sprint toward the medical spire, his bare feet slapping against the polished osmium floor, driven by an instinct he could not entirely explain. Back in the darkened laboratory, Doctor. Zale was out of time. The Solari operative had completely recovered from the liquid nitrogen blast. The freezing vapor dissipated, revealing the assassins standing tall, the white frost flaking off their active camouflage suit. The featureless visor locked back onto Zale. The high-frequency molecular blade hummed back to life, the lethal vibration distorting the dim emergency lighting. Zale backed up against the cold steel of the cryo unit, his hollow avian bones trembling. He had exhausted his environment. He had no more tricks. The assassin lunged forward, the blade sweeping up for a devastating final strike. The reinforced pneumatic doors of the laboratory did not just open. They were violently pried apart. Marcus Vance threw himself through the gap, a heavy, solid steel diagnostic wrench gripped in his right hand. He did not pause to assess the situation or calculate the odds. He saw the alien killer standing over the doctor, and he simply reacted with the raw, unrefined kinetic energy of a barroom brawler. The Solari operative, highly trained to anticipate the precise, elegant martial arts of the cooperative's elite guard, was completely unprepared for a human throwing a flying tackle. Marcus slammed into the assassin's midsection with the force of a runaway freight train. The impact knocked the breath from the operative and sent both of them crashing heavily into a row of sterilized medical cabinets. The molecular blade skittered across the floor, slicing a deep, glowing groove into the metal plating. The assassin recovered instantly, attempting to throw Marcus off using superior leverage. But Marcus fought with pure, unpredictable desperation. He did not aim for pressure points or nerve clusters. He simply brought the heavy steel wrench down in a wide, brutal arc, smashing it directly into the operative's featureless visor. The reinforced polymer cracked. The operative staggered back, their visual feed completely blinded by the spiderweb of fractures. Before the killer could reorient, Marcus drove his shoulder into their chest, pinning them against the wall, and delivered a second, decisive blow to the side of the helmet. The assassin slumped to the floor, completely unconscious. Marcus stood over the fallen operative, his chest heaving, his knuckles white around the grip of the wrench. He looked up at Zale, offering a breathless, lopsided grin. You doctors really need to invest in better security. Marcus gasped, tossing the wrench aside. Zale stared at the human, his brilliant mind struggling to process the sheer, chaotic violence he had just witnessed. It was entirely unrefined, mathematically highly improbable, and devastatingly effective. Before Zale could express his gratitude, the laboratory doors parted again. Doctor, Elena Rostova stepped through, a heavy plasma pistol gripped firmly in both hands. She swept the room, her eyes darting from the unconscious assassin to Marcus, and finally resting on Zale. She lowered the weapon, exhaling a sharp breath of relief. I saw the power grid anomaly, Elena said, moving quickly to secure the door behind her. Vrek is locking down the entire station. They are officially preparing the human delegation for deportation, and security forces are sweeping the sector. We have less than 2 hours before they purge this deck. He is not just deporting you, Zale said, his voice trembling slightly as he stepped away from the cryo unit. He used the incident with your food to blind the station's automated defenses. 3 unregistered Solari cargo shuttles docked in the lower industrial bays during the blackout. Vrek is smuggling something massive onto Aegis, and he sent this assassin to ensure I did not tell the council. Elena looked at the unconscious operative, her analytical mind rapidly piecing the puzzle together. Vrek was orchestrating a coup, and humanity was his convenient scapegoat. If they find us here, we are all dead, or worse, put on trial for attacking a cooperative official. Elena stated, her tone shifting into pure tactical command. We need to disappear. Right now, Doctor. You know this station better than anyone. Where can we go? Zale straightened his feathers, pushing past his fear. He was no longer just a neutral observer. He was an active participant in a rebellion. The primary maintenance underbelly. It is a labyrinth of thermal exhaust pipes and localized gravity wells. It is entirely unmonitored by the central AI, as the environment is considered too hazardous for biological life forms. Lead the way, Marcus said, ripping a piece of fabric from the assassin's suit to wrap around his cold feet. The trio slipped out of the laboratory just as the heavy, rhythmic thud of cooperative security boots echoed down the main corridor. Zale accessed a hidden diagnostic panel in the wall, revealing a narrow vertical maintenance shaft plunging straight down into the dark heart of the station. They descended into a world of industrial nightmares. The maintenance underbelly of Station Aegis was a sensory assault. Searing heat radiated from massive, pulsing plasma conduits. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and superheated lubricant. Gravity was inconsistent here, pulling slightly to the left in one corridor and feeling incredibly heavy in the next, forcing them to navigate with extreme caution. The only light came from the angry red glow of the thermal exhaust vents. They navigated the treacherous environment for an hour, finally pausing in a small, shielded alcove nestled between 2 massive water purification tanks. They were safe for the moment, completely hidden from Rek's sweeping security forces, but they were entirely cut off from the rest of the galaxy. We are officially fugitives, Marcus said, leaning against the warm metal of the tank. My captain is going to be incredibly upset. Elena ignored the attempt at humor. She turned to Zale, her eyes reflecting the dim red light. We have the data proving the shuttles bypassed security, but it is not enough. Rek controls the narrative. To stop him, to clear humanity's name, we have to find out exactly what is inside those shuttles. We have to catch him with the cargo. The shuttles docked in Auxiliary Bay 9, Zale replied, pulling up a schematic on his wrist-mounted holographic projector. It is deep within the Solari-controlled sector. The security there will be heavily fortified. Getting in will be nearly impossible. Impossible is just an engineering problem we haven't solved yet, Marcus countered, pushing off the tank. They stood in the sweltering dark, an unlikely alliance forged in the fires of a political conspiracy. A disgraced human engineer, a brilliant xenobiologist, and an avian doctor whose entire worldview had been shattered in a single evening. They were severely outgunned, trapped in a hostile environment and running out of time. They needed to move deeper into the shadows, directly into the heart of Rek's operation, to uncover a secret that could tear the galactic cooperative apart. A station built to withstand the fury of 3 dying stars was about to be undone by the quiet hum of unregistered cargo shuttles. Deep in the lightless underbelly of Aegis, a disgraced engineer, a xenobiologist, and an avian doctor were walking straight into the jaws of a galactic coup. The route to Auxiliary Bay 9 was not designed for biological entities. It was a chaotic industrial nightmare of superheated plasma lines, fluctuating localized zero-gravity fields, and high-voltage energy conduits that powered the station's massive exterior defensive shields. Marcus Vance took the lead, his bare feet wrapped tightly in scraps of the assassin's synthetic camouflage suit. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, hauling himself up sheer vertical maintenance shafts using nothing but raw upper body strength. Doctor. Elena Rostova followed close behind, her pristine lab coat discarded in the darkness, her focus absolute. She rapidly calculated the fluctuating gravity shears, calling out precise timing warnings as they leaped across bottomless, roaring thermal exhaust vents. Doctor. Zale, despite his towering intellect, was physically struggling to survive the journey. His hollow avian bones and delicate musculature were built for the pristine, climate-controlled environments of the upper medical decks, not the punishing, unpredictable gravity wells of the industrial sector. Yet, his encyclopedic knowledge of the station's intricate architecture was the only thing keeping them alive. He mentally mapped the mechanical labyrinth, guiding them safely away from active thermal purges and the sweeping sensor arcs of automated security drones. Whenever Zale faltered, his strength giving out on a steep climb, Marcus was there. The human engineer acted as a solid anchor of dense muscle and bone, catching the doctor mid-fall or hoisting him bodily over treacherous, sparking gaps. Zale observed this raw, unyielding endurance with profound fascination. The humans did not possess natural armor, specialized camouflage, or redundant nervous systems. But their sheer biological stubbornness was a formidable, undeniable asset. They refused to stop moving, driven by a fierce protective loyalty to their species. After 2 grueling hours of climbing through the station's metallic bowels, the blistering heat of the power conduits finally gave way to the freezing, hyper-filtered air of the restricted Solari sector. They crouched low on a graded industrial catwalk overlooking Auxiliary Bay 9. Below them, bathed in the harsh, stark blue of tactical security lighting, sat the 3 massive cargo shuttles that had slipped through the defense grid. The massive bay was swarming with Solari technicians in gray jumpsuits and heavily armored shock troops carrying high-yield plasma rifles. Getting down to the floor required impossible timing. Zale accessed a localized maintenance terminal bolted to the catwalk railing. His talons flew across the interface, temporarily blinding the bay's internal optical sensors by creating a cascading, localized feedback loop in the primary lighting array. Under the sudden cover of deep, flickering shadows, Marcus pried open a heavy steel ventilation grate, allowing the trio to drop silently to the deck behind a towering stack of metallic shipping containers. They crept toward the nearest shuttle, its massive loading ramp lowered heavily to the polished deck. Inside the cavernous hold, row upon row of sleek, black metallic crates were stacked to the ceiling, secured by heavy magnetic locks. Elena produced a small, handheld diagnostic scanner she had salvaged from Zale's laboratory. She approached the nearest crate, bypassing the complex biometric lock with a quick, improvised code sequence that forced the locking mechanism to hard reset. The heavy lid popped open with a quiet hiss of depressurization. Zale leaned in, his dark, multifaceted eyes adjusting to the gloom within the crate. Resting on a bed of dense, shock-absorbent foam were hundreds of small, intricate metallic collars. They were elegant, terrifying pieces of technology, lined with microscopic neuroconductors that glimmered faintly in the dim light. Zale recognized the design immediately from highly restricted, classified medical archives. A cold dread pooled in his stomach. They were neural-dampening devices. These were not weapons of war in any traditional sense. They did not blast through bulkheads or incinerate tissue. They were instruments of total, silent subjugation. When attached to the base of the skull, the collars intercepted and forcefully rewrote the electrical signals of the host's brain. They completely erased the wearer's free will, rendering them highly suggestible to external commands while leaving their cognitive functions and outward personalities entirely intact. It was a vile, illegal technology, universally banned across the galaxy for centuries. Elena's sharp tactical mind immediately connected the final pieces of Rex's grand design. The Solari ambassador had orchestrated the false biological attack in the human sector to intentionally force an emergency, high-security session of the High Council. Right now, the leaders of every major galactic faction were gathering in a single sealed assembly hall, effectively trapping themselves. Rek was not just trying to expel humanity to score political points. He intended to slip these dampeners onto the most powerful beings in the galaxy during the engineered chaos of the summit, turning the cooperative's leadership into his personal, obedient puppets. It was a perfectly executed, entirely bloodless coup, and humanity was the perfect distraction. Marcus reached into the crate, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line, and pulled one of the dampeners free. He shoved the illegal device deep into his pocket to serve as undeniable physical proof. Beside him, Zale rapidly linked his wrist-mounted projector to the crate's digital manifest, silently downloading the encrypted shipping data to completely corroborate the chemical evidence of the fake biological attack. They finally had everything they needed to tear Rek's empire down and clear humanity's name. The triumph lasted exactly 3 seconds. A sharp metallic clatter echoed sharply through the quiet cargo hold. A Solari technician, inspecting a nearby auxiliary power relay, had rounded the corner of the crate stack and locked eyes directly with the human engineer. The technician did not hesitate or ask questions. He slammed his fist into the emergency alarm panel on the bulkhead. Piercing, rhythmic klaxons shattered the silence of the bay. The heavy loading ramp of the shuttle immediately began to retract, whining loudly with hydraulic force, threatening to seal them inside the ship. Outside on the deck, a dozen heavily armored Solari shock troops snapped their plasma rifles up, moving with lethal, highly coordinated precision to completely surround the shuttle and seal off the only viable exit. The trio was completely boxed in. They stood in the dimly lit cargo hold of an enemy vessel, surrounded by thousands of pieces of illegal mind control technology, with a heavily armed death squad closing the net tight around them. Marcus tightened his grip on the heavy steel wrench he had carried all the way from the medical bay, fully aware that blunt force trauma would not deflect concentrated plasma fire. Their hard-won evidence, the terrible truth that could save humanity and the entire cooperative, was trapped with them deep behind enemy lines, while the fate of the galaxy hung by a thread in the assembly hall above. Plasma fire in a confined space does not just burn, it devours the very oxygen from the air. The cargo bay of the Solari shuttle instantly erupted into a blinding storm of lethal, superheated energy. Marcus shoved Zale and Elena forward, launching them down the steep angle of the retracting loading ramp. They hit the polished osmium deck just as the massive hydraulic doors slammed shut above them, shearing off the top of a stray plasma bolt that scorched the metal plating an inch from Marcus's head. The bay had transformed into a chaotic, lethal crossfire. Solari shock troops advanced with terrifying, synchronized precision, their weapons painting the dense shadows with harsh, stroboscopic flashes of blue death. Elena returned fire with her salvaged pistol, forcing the vanguard to take cover behind a heavy fuel transport. The plasma blasts from her weapon shattered the pristine deck, sending showers of molten sparks into the air. Marcus grabbed a heavy magnetic tow cable from a nearby maintenance cart, whipped it around a high-voltage power relay feeding the bay's secondary shields, and yanked with every ounce of his strength. The heavy relay shattered, raining a thick, blinding curtain of electrical arcs down upon the advancing soldiers. The sudden surge of raw energy temporarily scrambled the Solari targeting visors. It bought them exactly 4 seconds of pure, unadulterated chaos. They sprinted out of the restricted bay and plunged back into the dark, sweltering maze of the station's industrial corridors. The pursuit was relentless. The Solari hunters possessed thermal tracking optics and a ruthless engineered efficiency. The trio navigated the treacherous catwalks, leaping over roaring plasma conduits and dodging heavy, swinging automated cargo loaders that threatened to crush them into the bulkheads. During a desperate scramble up a sheer vertical access shaft, a stray plasma bolt from below shattered the grated walkway directly beneath them. A jagged piece of superheated shrapnel sliced deeply across Zale's left wing joint. The avian doctor stifled a sharp cry of pain, his iridescent blue feathers instantly darkening with blood, but he absolutely refused to slow his ascent. They hauled themselves into a massive dormant air scrubber duct, sealing the heavy pressurized service hatch firmly behind them. The dark, cylindrical tunnel offered a temporary sanctuary from the hunters. The distant, rhythmic thud of armored boots echoed through the metal plating below them, a constant reminder of the closing net. They had minutes, at best, before the Solari thermal scanners located their concentrated body heat. Elena immediately knelt beside Zale in the cramped space. She tore a sterile strip of fabric from the hem of her shirt and began binding the deep laceration on his wing. Her hands were remarkably steady, moving with the precise, practiced grace of a seasoned field medic under fire. Zale watched her face in the dim, ambient light of the duct. He saw the sheer exhaustion etched into her features, mixed with a fierce, unyielding determination that he found utterly captivating. He had spent his entire life observing the galaxy from the safe, sterilized distance of a laboratory, categorizing species by their biological weaknesses and evolutionary flaws. He now realized that human strength resided entirely in their spirit. They were creatures of profound empathy and terrifying resolve, willing to face absolute destruction to protect one another. "You are remarkably resilient, Doctor," Elena whispered, tying off the makeshift bandage with a sharp, securing tug. Zale offered a faint, strained smile, his dark eyes fixed entirely on hers. "And you are remarkably stubborn, Dr. Rostova. I believe I am beginning to understand the evolutionary advantage of your species." Elena met his gaze, the shared adrenaline and profound danger forging a bond thicker than any diplomatic treaty. There was a deep mutual respect passing between them in the stifling dark, an unspoken acknowledgement that their survival depended entirely on this impossible partnership. The quiet intimacy of the moment, a brief spark of romance amidst the chaos, was a sudden reminder of exactly what they were fighting to protect. The silence was violently shattered by the harsh grind of metal tearing open at the far end of the duct. The hunters had found their thermal signature. The trio scrambled down the steep decline of the ventilation shaft, dropping out into a wide, heavily fortified environmental control junction. This was the final security checkpoint before the civilian access elevators leading straight to the High Council Assembly Hall. It was also a perfectly executed trap. 2 full squads of Solari heavy infantry blocked the exit. They carried interlocking riot suppression gear and heavy repeating plasma cannons. Marcus pulled Elena and Zale behind the thick steel casing of a massive atmospheric circulation fan, just as the entire corridor erupted into violence. Plasma fire immediately rained down upon their position, chewing through the heavy metal shielding with terrifying speed. Elena checked her pistol. The energy cell was completely depleted. They were utterly outgunned, pinned down, and seconds away from a brutal execution. Marcus leaned against the violently vibrating metal casing, his analytical mind racing through 100 impossible scenarios. He looked up at the massive circulation fan, tracing the heavy ductwork, and then down at the master environmental control panel mounted on the wall just an arm's length away from their rapidly deteriorating cover. He reached into the makeshift satchel he had fashioned from a torn piece of his paper medical gown before fleeing Zale's laboratory during the assassin's attack. Marcus had instinctively grabbed the confiscated jar of his ultra-spicy ghost pepper curry powder from the doctor's diagnostic table. It was the exact same biological nightmare that had triggered the initial station-wide lockdown, currently sitting innocuous and innocent in his hand. Marcus turned to Zale, a wild, dangerous glint in his eyes that defied all logic. A doctor. What happens when a highly sensitive, biologically engineered predator inhales pure, weaponized pain? Zale looked at the small jar of concentrated spice, then at the massive ventilation intake feeding the junction's localized air supply. The avian doctor's beak parted in sheer awe at the tactical audacity of the human engineer. Their sensory organs will experience a catastrophic, cascading overload, Zale replied, his voice breathless with sudden realization. It will completely neutralize them without causing permanent tissue damage. Marcus did not hesitate. He lunged from the safety of their melting cover, diving toward the control panel as a relentless volley of plasma scorched the air mere inches above his head. He smashed his fist into the manual override console, bypassing the safety protocols and immediately reversing the polarity of the massive circulation fans. The giant metallic blades whined in protest, violently shifting from pulling air out of the room to pushing a hurricane-force gale directly into the faces of the advancing Solari troops. With a swift, brutal motion, Marcus shattered the glass jar against the edge of the intake grate. He hurled the entire payload of ultra-concentrated ghost pepper powder directly into the spinning blades. The station's industrial environmental systems instantly atomized the dry, volatile spice, transforming the culinary ingredient into a localized, highly concentrated aerosol cloud. The reddish-brown mist exploded outward, riding the gale-force wind and washing entirely over the heavily armored shock troops. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The Solari infantry, whose olfactory and respiratory systems were highly evolved for extreme hypersensitivity to detect trace chemical pheromones, were entirely unprepared for the sheer biological violence of Earth's flora. The capsaicin bound instantly to their pain receptors. Elite soldiers dropped their heavy plasma cannons, tearing frantically at their interlocking helmets. They collapsed to the polished deck, convulsing, violently coughing, and completely blinded by the agonizing, simulated fire burning rapidly through their nerve endings. The formidable death squad, capable of conquering entire star systems, was completely incapacitated by a generous pinch of human seasoning. Marcus grabbed a discarded heavy plasma rifle from the deck, ensuring the stolen neural dampener was still secure in his pocket. The path to the elevator was completely wide open. They stepped carefully over the writhing, weeping bodies of the Solari guards and entered the sleek glass elevator tube. The car shot upward, accelerating smoothly toward the pristine diplomatic levels of Station Aegis. They had survived the lethal underbelly and successfully weaponized their own supposed biological menace. But breaking into a heavily fortified assembly hall to accuse the most powerful ambassador in the galaxy of treason would require an entirely different kind of warfare. Vrek was currently addressing the High Council, and his trap was already springing shut. A single lie spoken with enough conviction can shatter 1,000 truths, especially when an entire galaxy is preparing to vote on it. The Grand Assembly Hall of Station Aegis was a breathtaking masterpiece of architectural intimidation. A massive amphitheater carved from living crystal and suspended above a glowing artificial nebula. Representatives from 300 star systems sat in tiered balconies, murmuring in 100 different languages. The air was thick with tension, fear, and the absolute certainty that humanity was a volatile plague that needed to be surgically excised from the cosmos. Standing at the central podium, bathed in a stark pillar of white light, was Ambassador Vrek. The Solari diplomat looked magnificent, his obsidian scales gleaming, his crimson robes draped perfectly over his towering frame. He was delivering the performance of his life. We offered them a hand of friendship, and they answered with a weapon of mass suffering. Rek's velvet voice rolled across the cavernous hall, translated instantly into the earpieces of every delegate. You have all seen the horrific footage, a Class 5 neuroagent, unleashed in our very sanctuary by the human delegation. They lack discipline. They lack morality. They are a primitive, violent species that uses diplomacy as a shield for their inherent savagery. I call for an immediate, unanimous vote. Humanity must be permanently exiled from cooperative space, their star charts erased, their borders eternally quarantined for the safety of all civilized life. A heavy, terrifying agreement rippled through the assembly. The delegates, still rattled by the station-wide alarms and the terrifying broadcast of Marcus Vance supposedly melting from the inside out, began to activate their voting consoles. The glowing runes of expulsion flickered to life across the room. Rex smiled, a cold, calculated curving of his lips. His coup was moments away from becoming legally binding. Then the reinforced 10-ton doors of the Grand Assembly Hall exploded inward. The heavy osmium slabs groaned and violently buckled under the sustained, concentrated heat of a heavy plasma rifle, crashing onto the polished floor with a deafening seismic impact that shook the crystal amphitheater. The delegates gasped in unified horror, the voting process instantly halting. Security forces stationed around the perimeter drew their weapons, aiming at the billowing cloud of superheated smoke pouring through the breached entrance. From the smoke emerged three figures that looked as though they had just crawled through a war zone. Marcus Vance, barefoot and covered in engine grease, held a massive smoking Solari plasma rifle across his chest. Beside him stood Dr. Elena Rostova, her hair singed, her eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fury, a salvaged energy pistol gripped tightly in her hand. And standing between them, leaning heavily on the human engineer, was Chief Medical Officer Zale. The brilliant avian doctor was a battered ruin. His iridescent blue feathers stained a deep, horrifying crimson from his wounded wing, his breath ragged, but his posture radiating an absolute, undeniable authority. "Hold your fire," Zale's voice, amplified by his natural avian resonance, cut through the panicked shouts of the assembly. "I am Chief Medical Officer Zale, and I command you to lower your weapons immediately." The station's regular security forces, recognizing the highest-ranking medical official on Aegis, hesitated. Their plasma rifles wavered. Vrek's smile vanished, replaced by a momentary microscopic flicker of genuine panic. He recovered instantly, pointing a long, clawed finger at the trio. "Arrest them! They are accomplices to the human terrorist. They have assaulted my guards and broken quarantine." Zale did not flinch. He limped forward, leaving the support of Marcus's arm, and stood alone in the center of the vast hall, directly facing the towering Solari ambassador. "The only terrorist in this room is you, Vrek. The biological attack was a fabrication, a calculated lie to trigger a security blackout." Zale tapped the shattered remains of his wrist-mounted holographic projector. Despite the brutal journey, the device flickered to life, projecting a massive high-resolution data feed directly into the air above the central podium. The delegates gasped as the raw telemetry of the station's power grid filled the room, clearly showing the intentional diversion of energy away from Auxiliary Bay 9. While you were completely blinded by fear, looking at a human eating a spicy, harmless plant from his homeworld, Ambassador Rex smuggled 3 unregistered cargo shuttles into the lower industrial sector. Zale declared, his voice echoing with absolute conviction. He used the panic as a smokescreen to bring illegal weapons onto Station Aegis. "Lies," Rex roared, slamming his fist onto the podium. "Forged data by a disgraced, compromised official. Security, take them down." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes locked dead on Rex. He reached into his grease-stained pocket and pulled out the intricate, terrifying metallic collar. He held it high above his head for the entire assembly to see. The microscopic neuroconductors glinted menacingly in the amphitheater's bright light. "This is what was on those shuttles," Marcus yelled, his voice carrying the rough, undeniable weight of a man who had fought for his life to deliver the truth. Neural dampeners, thousands of them. He wasn't trying to expel humanity to keep you safe. He was trying to get all of you into this sealed room so he could strap these collars to your necks and turn the High Council into his personal puppet show. Complete stunned silence fell over the Grand Assembly Hall. The delegates stared at the illegal technology in Marcus's hand. The implications crashed down upon them like a physical weight. The technology was universally recognized and universally feared. Vreck's grand manipulative narrative completely collapsed in an instant. Vreck looked around the room. He saw the horrified faces of the delegates. He saw the station's security forces slowly turning their weapons away from the humans and aiming them squarely at the podium. The Solari ambassador realized his political maneuver was utterly destroyed. He had lost the long game, but he was a creature of absolute ruthlessness. He still had a tactical advantage hidden in plain sight. If diplomacy fails, Vreck hissed, his vertical slit eyes narrowing into voids of pure malice. Then force must suffice. Activate the network. He was not speaking to the assembly. He was speaking to the dozen Solari aides positioned strategically behind the seating rows of the most powerful faction leaders. In unison, the loyalists reached beneath their flowing robes, pulling out sleek, black activation relays. They had already planted secondary, localized dampening fields under the delegates' chairs. A high-pitched, agonizing frequency suddenly flooded the crystal hall. It was a localized neural scrambler, designed to temporarily paralyze the nervous system and prevent anyone from resisting while the collars were applied. High Council members collapsed into their seats, clutching their heads in agony, completely unable to control their own bodies. "Take the room," Vreck commanded his loyalists. The Solari aides lunged forward, producing dampener collars from their robes, moving swiftly toward the paralyzed faction leaders. Marcus and Elena were entirely unaffected. Human neurology, evolved to endure massive adrenaline spikes and the chaotic sensory input of an aggressive homeworld, was uniquely resistant to the specific frequency Vreck had deployed. To them, it just sounded like a terrible, grating feedback loop. "Elena, the relays," Marcus shouted, tossing his heavy plasma rifle aside. Firing a high-yield weapon into a crowded room of paralyzed diplomats was a guaranteed disaster. This required precision and blunt force. Elena did not hesitate. She vaulted over the central barricade, her mind rapidly analyzing the acoustic geometry of the amphitheater. The relays were broadcasting from the outer rim of the seating tiers. She sprinted up the crystal steps, intercepting the nearest Solari loyalist just as he prepared to snap a collar onto an ambassador from the deep core worlds. Elena tackled the operative from the side, using her momentum to send them both crashing down a flight of stairs. As they rolled, she snatched the activation relay from his hand and smashed it violently against the sharp edge of a crystal banister. One sector of the agonizing frequency died instantly. The delegates in that section gasped for air, their motor functions rapidly returning. On the other side of the hall, Marcus was a blur of calculated human aggression. He grabbed a heavy ornamental flagstaff from a decorative display, snapping the ceremonial banner off to create a solid metal quarterstaff. He vaulted into the tiered seating, moving with the terrifying, unpredictable kinetic energy that had saved Zale in the laboratory. A Solari operative raised a concealed plasma pistol, but Marcus swept the heavy staff upward, knocking the weapon into the ceiling before delivering a crushing blow to the operative's midsection. Marcus ripped the relay from the fallen alien's belt and crushed it beneath his heel. The room was descending into absolute chaos. Vreck, realizing his final gambit was falling apart due to the sheer stubborn resilience of two humans, drew a concealed energy blade from his crimson robes. He leaped over the podium, abandoning his political facade entirely, and charged directly at Zale. The avian doctor was the key. If Zale died, Vreck could still claim the data was forged. Zale stood his ground, He was exhausted, bleeding, and physically outmatched, but he refused to retreat. He looked at the charging assassin, ready to meet his end with dignity. A heavy mass slammed into wreck from the flank. Marcus Vance had cleared the seating tiers, launching himself across the central floor. He tackled the towering Solari ambassador, sending both of them skidding across the polished osmium. Vrex slashed violently with his energy blade, singeing the fabric of Marcus's stolen trousers. But the human engineer rolled out of the way, sweeping Rex's legs out from under him. As Vrek hit the floor, struggling to bring his weapon to bear, Elena arrived. She planted her boot firmly on Rex's wrist, pinning the arm holding the energy blade to the ground. She leveled her salvaged, now recharged energy pistol directly at the center of the ambassador's forehead. Her chest heaved, her eyes cold and absolute. "I think your time on the floor has expired, Ambassador," Elena said, her voice echoing perfectly through the suddenly quiet hall. The remaining Solari loyalists, seeing their leader pinned and the dampening network failing, dropped their weapons in surrender. The agonizing frequency faded completely, replaced by the heavy collective breathing of 300 terrified diplomats. The station's central security forces surged forward, securing the loyalists and placing heavy restraint cuffs on Rek. The Solari ambassador glared up at Marcus and Elena, his obsidian scales practically vibrating with fury. His meticulously planned, multi-layered conspiracy, designed to subjugate a galaxy, had been utterly dismantled by a mild misunderstanding over a bowl of extremely spicy food and the sheer, violent tenacity of a species he had dismissed as primitive. Marcus leaned down, retrieved his confiscated jar of ghost pepper powder from his pocket, and placed it gently on Rex's chest. "Next time you want to feel a little fire, just ask for the recipe." The assembly hall erupted into a cacophony of voices. The threat was neutralized, the conspiracy exposed, and the truth laid bare. But as Zale limped forward to join Marcus and Elena, watching the disgraced ambassador being dragged away, a new massive question hung in the air. Humanity had just saved the Galactic Cooperative, but they had done so by proving exactly how dangerous, unpredictable, and fiercely unyielding they truly were. The real test of their place in the universe was only just beginning. The debris of a shattered conspiracy takes far longer to sweep away than the broken crystal of an assembly hall door. But for the first time in a millennium, the Galactic Cooperative was cleaning up its own hubris instead of sweeping an inconvenient truth under the rug. The days immediately following Ambassador Rex's dramatic arrest were a chaotic whirlwind of emergency tribunals, frantic security audits, and absolute political upheaval. Station Aegis remained locked down, not to contain a human biological weapon, but to systematically root out the intricate web of Solari loyalists Rek had embedded throughout the command structure. The sheer scale of the intended coup horrified the High Council. They had been inches away from eternal subjugation, saved only by the blind, unpredictable intervention of the very species they had gathered to expel. When the dust finally settled, the political landscape of the known galaxy was fundamentally altered. The Solari Concord faced heavy sanctions and a complete restructuring of their diplomatic corps. Meanwhile, humanity was no longer the volatile pariah knocking at the gates. We were the undisputed heroes of the hour. During a highly publicized, deeply solemn ceremony in the repaired Grand Assembly Hall, Earth was officially granted full permanent membership on the High Council. Marcus Vance stood awkwardly through the entire proceeding, wearing a perfectly tailored, exceptionally uncomfortable dress uniform, desperately wishing he was back in an engine room. Doctor, Elena Rostova stood beside him, her posture radiating a quiet, undeniable pride. They were not recognized merely for their brute physical resilience or their tactical improvisation. The elder species of the galaxy had learned a profound, humbling lesson. For centuries, the cooperative had equated peace with total predictability. They had built an empire of sterilized corridors and flawless logic, categorizing anything loud, messy, or passionate as an inherent threat. Rek had nearly conquered them by weaponizing that exact sterile complacency. He used their fear of the unknown to blind them to the danger lurking in their own shadows. Humanity survived the trap because we are a species born from chaos. We evolved on a volatile world, forced to adapt, to fight, and to constantly question our surroundings. We brought that unyielding, messy dedication to the truth into the pristine halls of Station Aegis. The philosophical takeaway for the galaxy was monumental. True understanding requires looking past the surface of our immediate, instinctual fears. The unknown should not be a trigger for automatic hostility or quarantine. Whether the unknown is a strange new civilization reaching out from the edge of the spiral arm, or a terrifyingly pungent dish of seasoned vegetables from a distant homeworld, it must be met with genuine curiosity. We must taste the fire to truly know the world. Weeks later, the frantic pace of the summit had finally cooled into the steady, bureaucratic hum of daily station life. Doctor. Zale stood on the primary observation deck, looking out through the massive, curved osmium glass window at the glowing purple hues of the artificial nebula. His left wing was secured in a sleek, silver medical sling, a lingering badge of honor from his desperate climb through the industrial sector. He was no longer just the chief medical officer. He was a recognized savior of the cooperative, a title he found deeply exhausting. The soft pneumatic hiss of the observation deck doors announced a visitor. Elena Rostova walked into the starlit room, having shed her formal diplomatic attire for a comfortable, worn leather jacket and standard ship boots. She stepped up to the massive window, standing close enough to Zale that their reflections merged against the backdrop of the stars. "I just finished the final debriefing with the Central Committee," Elena said, her voice a soft, comforting presence in the quiet room. "They are officially terrified of us, but they respect us. I suppose that is the best we could hope for." Zale turned his head slightly, his dark, multifaceted eyes reflecting the nebula's glow. "Respect is a far sturdier foundation than fear. Dr. Rostova, your species has proven that resilience is not merely physical. It is a state of mind. You simply refuse to accept the parameters of defeat." "We are a very stubborn people," Elena agreed, a genuine warm smile touching her lips. Zale reached out with his uninjured arm, his delicate talons gently brushing against her hand. Elena did not pull away. Instead, she shifted her hand, weaving her fingers naturally through his. It was a quiet, profound crossing of a monumental divide. They were two scientists who had found a perfect intellectual rhythm in the midst of a violent crisis. And that rhythm had evolved into an undeniable romantic gravity. They stood together in the quiet dark, no longer just allies or colleagues, but true partners anchored in the vast, swirling chaos of the cosmos. Their peaceful solitude was abruptly interrupted by the heavy, unmistakable footsteps of Marcus Vance. The engineer strolled onto the observation deck, carrying a small silver tray. He looked significantly happier than he had during the diplomatic ceremonies. He had his tool belt back. His hands were comfortably stained with a fresh layer of engine grease, and he wore a wide, mischievous grin. "I hate to interrupt the romantic astrophysics," Marcus announced, setting the tray down on a nearby viewing console. "But I felt we needed to officially celebrate our victory. My brother sent another care package on the last transport from Earth." Zale's feathers instantly bristled with a purely instinctual panic. He took a protective step in front of Elena, eyeing the small tray as if it contained an active thermal detonator. "Marcus, I swear to the stars," Elena warned, pointing a stern finger at the engineer. "If you brought another ghost pepper anywhere near this sector, I will personally throw you out of an airlock. Relax, Doc. Marcus laughed, holding his hands up in surrender. I learned my lesson. No more biological warfare on cooperative soil. I promise. He lifted a small silver dome from the tray, revealing a single tiny glass bottle filled with a mild, pale green liquid. This, Marcus declared proudly, is standard mild green jalapeno sauce. On Earth, we feed this to children to build character. It registers at barely 2,000 Scoville units. Compared to the curry, this is basically chilled water. Zale stared at the tiny bottle. His brilliant analytical mind warred heavily with the terrifying memories of the Hazard team footage. However, the avian doctor had just spent the last several weeks preaching the profound importance of embracing the unknown. He had lectured the High Council on the necessity of meeting humanity's strange customs, with open curiosity rather than fearful rejection. To back down now would be a betrayal of his own newly forged philosophy. It is completely harmless, Zale asked, his voice entirely devoid of confidence. Totally harmless, Marcus confirmed, pulling a microscopic droplet of the green sauce from the bottle with a sterile glass pipette. He offered it to the doctor. Elena watched with highly amused skepticism, crossing her arms over her chest. You really do not have to do this, Zale. I must, Zale replied, his tone adopting the solemn gravity of a man walking willingly to his execution. For science. And for cultural integration? Zale extended his beak, allowing Marcus to place the microscopic drop of green jalapeno sauce directly onto his tongue. For exactly 2 seconds. Nothing happened. Zale blinked, his multifaceted eyes processing the tangy, slightly acidic flavor. He looked at Marcus, ready to declare the experiment a complete, anticlimactic success. Then the capsaicin hit his highly unadapted avian pain receptors. Zale's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Every single iridescent blue feather on his body instantly puffed out to maximum volume, making him look twice his normal size. He let out a sharp, high-pitched squawk that echoed wildly around the observation deck, completely abandoning his dignified posture. He began hopping rapidly from foot to foot, flapping his good wing frantically as if trying to physically fan the imaginary fire raging inside his beak. "Ooh, water," Zale croaked, his voice entirely stripped of its usual velvet smoothness. My internal systems are experiencing a catastrophic thermal overload. The human has deceived me again. Marcus burst into a roaring fit of laughter, clutching his stomach as he watched the brilliant chief medical officer perform an impromptu, panicked tap dance. Elena quickly grabbed a flask of chilled water from the console and handed it to Zale, shaking her head, though a bright, uncontrollable laugh escaped her lips as well. As Zale desperately chugged the water, his feathers slowly settling back into place, he glared at the grinning engineer. It was a glare filled with profound annoyance, a lingering burning sensation, and an undeniable begrudging affection for these ridiculous, terrifying, magnificent humans. They had brought fire to the cold, sterile stars, and the galaxy would never be the same. Thank you so much for watching. Space travelers, if you enjoyed this journey into the wild, spicy, and unpredictable world of Station Aegis, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your fellow sci-fi fans. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Drop the word spice if you think you could survive Marcus Vance's legendary ghost pepper curry. And do not forget to hit that hype button so the algorithm knows to send this video to more viewers just like you. I will see you in the next transmission.